How is it going, everyone? My name is Quinlan from Team Vision, and I'm presenting you guys a brand new Vision video. So today, we're going to be taking a look at one of the top 4 decks currently defining the standard meta post EB-09. Now, as we get into this list, I think there's a couple of things we should all keep in mind about what does meta defining really even mean. It's time to define meta defining. So when we say something is meta defining, that means that it is structuring the current state of the game as far as deck representation, as well as general playstyles within that meta. I think we can all remember a time where some mermaids were more or less dominating the entire meta. And by dominating, I also mean defining. There was a time, of course, where Bermuda Triangle reigned victorious over all decks. They seemed to have every resource, they were way too strong and way more powerful than any deck in that format. For something to be defining doesn't exactly mean it has to be the best deck, but in a game like Vanguard, where Bushiroad typically balances their game by just releasing better cards and what we call power creeping, typically the best decks, the top 3 or 4 decks, are going to be what defines the pace and the meta state. So going back to those fish, it wasn't a matter of finding a deck that was just really, really good. It was about finding a deck that beat Bermuda Triangle. I know there was a time where people were speculating that Nubatama could have possibly been the threat or the way to beat Bermuda Triangle, but after realizing that the deck just wasn't strong enough, that kind of subsided. But the point being here that Bermuda Triangle really defined the meta by really setting the pace and standard of what a deck had to accomplish in order to be meta. Looking back at how Bushiroad, again, balances their games with power creeps and powerful set releases, you can wonder why Q4 isn't really a relevant set anymore, excluding the couple of cards that are played in the meta decks. For example, you'll never really see a full Overlord Waterfall Q4 deck topping anything, but you will see Waterfall in Blademaster decks that are seen tops in both Japan as well as in America at BCS Atlanta, Georgia. But anyway, to finish out the definition, meta defining is basically anything that establishes what decks can be relevant and what decks are relevant in that format at that time. So, without further ado, let's take a look at what are the top 4 meta defining decks. Number 4, Narukami. So, why is Narukami at this number 4 slot? So Narukami hasn't received support since BTO 5. So how is it still keeping up in the meta? Narukami being at the number 4 slot doesn't necessarily mean that it's the 4th strongest deck. We at Vision, however, believe it is at number 4 in determining the meta. When you take a look at how the current meta is played out, the meta is fairly aggressive, and most games are typically over by the second grade 3 turn, which we'll go over a little bit later. Narukami in the current meta does a fairly good job at keeping pace. Not only is Gauntlet Buster Dragon very strong in an Excel heavy format, those extra crits can close out games very quickly if your opponent does not have a PG. Utilizing the extra power and the extra crit, you can really push your opponent to 5 or even 6 damage with one fell sideways card. And looking deeper than just Gauntlet Buster Dragon, one thing that Narukami is very good at is removing specific pieces. In the current format, you have decks like Gancelot and Mordred, which require specific pieces, such as Blaster Blade and Blaster Dark. Narukami has the unique ability to be able to just get rid of those pieces entirely, and they don't just go to your drop zone. If the pieces went to drop zone, the decks do have tools to retrieve them back, so just killing them is not going to be enough. But Narukami has the ability to bind those pieces away entirely and not allow the players to get those pieces back. Of course, good players won't just drop all of their pieces early to allow the Narukami player to get rid of them. But either way, this does force that player to play a different play style, which a deck or a tool or a piece that requires someone to play differently, we are calling meta defining. We do, however, believe that Narukami does struggle in a lot of matchups, especially against the decks that are above it on this list. So, with that, that's number 4 with Narukami. What is the next deck? Number 3. your edgy friends are back. And of course, I'm not talking about just any edgy friends. I'm talking about Shadow Paladins. So Shadow Paladins got quite the rework with Illusionary Revenger Mordred Phantom. Just look at him. And by this, I mean the deck just got a ton better. In the previous meta, the Shadow Paladin deck just couldn't quite keep up with the pressure of the newer decks coming out. Phantom Blaster Dragon and GBD just didn't quite have the speed and volatility that current Mordred has. One thing that's very, very important to mention with Shadow Paladins is it actually sets the pace of the meta. Shadow Paladin defines the pace of the meta by making it really, really difficult to continue games past the second grade 3 ride. If your deck doesn't really have the ability to take out Shadow Paladins before they get to their second or even third Mordred ride, then you're probably already eating way too much damage and have dropped way too many resources to live up to this point. A typical second grade 3 Mordred turn can look like 2 restanding Blaster Darks and a Mordred swinging for very high numbers. The scariest part about this is it takes very little resources to build up to this point, and it only takes 1 counterblast to actually perform the restand. So you can't just counter starve them, you can't just deny their resources, and the deck searches out the pieces by itself. So the more time you give Shadow Paladin to find the pieces, the more likely they are to get off this crazy combo. And the more time you give them, the more likely they're going to have a rearguard circle with 3 force markers, which means Danger Lunge is lurking. And by Danger Lunge, I mean this very scary unit. That's a waterfall on rearguard circle. Either way, Shadow Paladin is an incredibly scary deck that can define the meta by setting the pace. Of course, we didn't talk about all the reasons why we believe Shadow Paladin to be one of the best decks, but keep in mind that Shadow Paladin has a reliable searching engine, a reliable way to get your pieces out of deck, and it's consistently deck thinning, which not only makes it a very, very scary deck to deal with, but it in fact makes it one of the top decks that do define the meta. On top of being a very scary deck, Shadow Paladins has also seen a ton of representation across the world. Many Shadow Paladin decks have already topped at events and won. So because of these reasons, we believe that Shadow Paladin has earned its right and its spot on number 3 on the top meta-defining decks. And at this point, there's still 2 more decks that we believe define the meta even a little bit more than Shadow Paladin, so let's take a look at the next spot. Number 2. Pale Moon. The Circus Ladies are back, and I am so excited. I have been a huge fan of Pale Moon ever since they came out in the V-Series. I think that in the standard format, they're just one of the more fun decks. Being able to manipulate your soul and toss things in and out, to me, was just always a lot of fun. So, of course, Bushiroad naturally said, let's take that deck and make it really easy and really good. And that's what they did. So Bushy said, see you later, Golden Beast Tamer. See you later, Alice. Unless you play the bad build. I have a newer, better card for you. Silverthorns. All of them, actually. There's a lot. So the Silverthorn variation of Pale Moon is an incredibly strong deck. Before we talk about why it's meta-defining, let's talk about why it's so good. So first of all, you have this little bitty. Luquier is one of the most influential cards in the standard format currently. For 2 counterblasts, you get to spit out an entire field. On top of that, you're soul charging and choosing what cards you want to put into your soul throughout the game, starting at turn 1. And so by the time you get to the Luquier play, you already have your soul set up with a number of Silverthorn cards that can all be used to your disposal. You also have a number of units that countercharge. So you don't have to really worry about having 4 damage or 5 damage just to get your skill off. If you're sitting at a comfortable 3 damage, you can reliably countercharge per turn to ensure that you're getting off your Luquier skill as long as you're taking 1 damage. And on top of Luquier, you have this fine little bitty, Doriane. Not only does she protect your board from cards like Gauntlet Buster Dragon or Hyuga, but it allows you to draw a number of cards, typically between 2 and 3, every single turn at the end of your turn. It gives you either extra shield value or possibly the combo tool or piece that you needed to really pull off your next big turn. So the deck has it all. You're searching your pieces out, you're soul charging the units that you need, you're drawing into your combo pieces, you're swinging for huge numbers between 4 and 5 attacks a turn, you're consistently rewriting into your grade 3, and you're drawing 2 to 3 cards at the end of every single turn. Then let's break down why is that meta defining. A big joke about Standard is that if you win the dice roll, you win. Well, Pale Moon is the epitome of that. When your opponent is at 9 or 10k base, it is very, very difficult to guard against the onslaught of 30k plus attacks. This is guaranteeing 20k or 25k shield per attack. And there's so many. The reason you can do this is because Luquier does not have any restrictions against your opponent needing to be on grade 3 or even needing a grade 3 in soul. Therefore, when your opponent is on grade 2, and like I said, at a 9 or a 10k base, you can be swinging this crazy big turn before your opponent even has the chance to ride their primary unit. And not only is this fundamentally a very solid deck, it has incredibly good matchups against all the top decks. Against Narukami, it protects its pieces and keeps them off the board so Narukami can't delete any of them. Against Shadow Paladins, it keeps up to pace with them while drawing a lot of cards to keep up with the offensive pressure that Shadow Paladin pushes out. And if you're looking at other decks in the meta, such as Dark Irregulars, Dimension Police, Aquaforce, or any other decks that you kind of see representation across the board, this deck is just faster. So because of Pale Moon's super aggressive and consistent playstyle, it is 100% a deck that defines the meta and is absolutely a force to be reckoned with. But if Pale Moon is hyper aggressive and incredibly consistent, what can possibly define the meta better than them? Well, let me show you with the final meta defining deck of this list. Number 1. Murakumo. Oh man. I remember when the Zanbaku lock was the scariest thing to happen to Vanguard. And to be fair, Zanbaku was really the first card that actually interacted with your opponent in Standard Vanguard. I remember in Primitive V-Series era, where all you had to do was just hit your opponent harder than they were hitting you. And that's how you won. So Murakumo was the first deck to kind of change that mentality, and because of that, it sat at the top of the meta for a very long time. How then is Murakumo back at the top of the meta? If you look back at the entire video thus far, I've given a number of reasons of why each of those decks are meta defining. If you take all of those reasons and shove them into one deck, that's pretty much Murakumo. To recap a little bit and put it in terms of Murakumo, this deck just has it all. If you're looking at how Murakumo can be compared to Narukami as far as utility, it has an equal amount of board clear, but even more consistently. Almost every single game, you're going to be able to find your Hyuga, and Hyuga does the exact same thing as Gauntlet Buster Dragon, but better. It doesn't just bind the front row, it removes your opponent's entire field and throws it back into their deck. Now, of course, you're not permanently removing these pieces, but you're forcing your opponent to draw back into the pieces before they can put them onto the field or have them in hand. And you must be thinking, a skill like that must be a very large cost. It's not. In a deck that soul charges constantly and runs between 11 and 13 grade 3s, the only requirement for the Hyuga skill to evaporate your opponent's entire board is to Soul Blast 1 grade 3. What? Not only is that doing the same thing that Narukami does in board control, as far as removing pieces such as Blaster Dark or Blaster Blade from the utility kit of your opponent, it's also removing the entire pressure of a board state. So then looking at Shadow Paladin, how can Murakumo keep up with the pace of Shadow Paladin? Well, the utility and toolboxiness of Murakumo makes it so that it can consistently run one-ofs and search the pieces out when they need them. So not only does this allow the Murakumo to have a very adaptive playstyle, but it allows it to get those pieces out when they need them to either stop an opponent's aggression or be more aggressive themselves when your opponent is playing too conservatively. And we can go into a huge discussion about all the utility options that Murakumo has in the one-ofs, but we'll leave it there. We should take a better look at Shiryuki. Shiryuki has been a threat for a number of sets now in the standard format, but in the Hyuga Shiryuki deck, it is even stronger. Now, of course, Shiryuki doesn't really do anything different, but this deck has a large number of soul charging options, so the Shiryuki skill is almost always active, live, or available to you. And as we've been talking this whole time, the meta is incredibly aggressive, so a well-timed Shiryuki can very easily stop the aggression of your opponent or allow yourself to go much more aggressive in your big grade 3 or second grade 3 turn. In terms of meta defining, Shiryuki really stops the pressure of a lot of decks. If you look at decks that saw tops earlier, such as Ezel or Neo Nectar, or even Bermuda Triangle, Shiryuki stops a lot of their pressure. And of course, Shiryuki is not just effective in decks that can't hit 22, it's effective in all decks. Taking again a look at how it can play against Narukami. Narukami has a number of restanders, and Shiryuki minus 10k on a Cho-Oh makes it so that 2 attacks are now minus 10k, because that Cho-Oh that's going to restand is minus 10k both times. So not only can Shiryuki really deal with these small number Excel clans, it can also deal with decks like Mordred or Neo Nectar. A lot of the times in the big crazy Mordred turn, it comes down to you can only guard 2 or 3 of the attacks at most, and you have to let some of the attacks through. With the use of Shiryuki, it's very easy to negate a lot of that power so that you can guard more of the attacks and live longer. On top of the fact that you have Shiryuki defensively and aggressively, the board clear that we mentioned earlier really puts a stop to a lot of these decks that have to build up a consistent board and able to have their final big grade 3 turn. So to sum it up, Murakumo really has every tool necessary to take the advantage. It can stop your opponent's aggression, it can force your own aggression, it has board clear, it has huge numbers. I haven't even mentioned the fact that there are cards and units that bump the power of your entire field, so your whole field is already swinging for Pale Moon numbers. Taking a look at why this deck defines the meta better than Pale Moon, let's take a specific look at that matchup. So the Murakumo versus Pale Moon matchup is quite unique in the sense that Murakumo can't really board clear Pale Moon, since Pale Moon sucks everything back into the soul at the end of the term anyway. As we've already mentioned, Shiryuki is, again, such an incredible tool. So as Pale Moon is setting up their board, using the Lukier skill, flooding the entire field with Silverthorn units everywhere, God, jeez. The Murakumo player can simply drop 1 or even 2 Shiryukis to slow down or completely stop that player's turn. As we mentioned before, Pale Moon's hitting about 30k attacks per column, which in any other matchup is around 20k guard. However, after 1 Shiryuki effect or 1 Shiryuki skill, you minus 10k the majority of their board, which means that instead of having 30k attacks, they're only swinging for 20k. Murakumo has the unique skill of being able to search out one-ofs or just the vital card that you need at any given time. Because of this, the Murakumo player can adapt to the Pale Moon aggression in the style that it needs to. And of course, when the Pale Moon player goes first, the Murakumo player is still playing from behind just because of the threat of that first grade 3 aggression, but if the Murakumo player can have a solid response turn, it can actually stabilize and make sure it's set up with 1 or 2 Shiryukis for the following and second grade 3 turn from the Pale Moon player. We can go into more examples of why Murakumo really dominates the meta, but I think you guys get the point. And with that, that concludes our top 4 lists. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you guys are not already a part of our Vision Community Discord server, join it. Link is right here in the description. Join the server and join the conversation, and you can possibly provide the topic of the next Vision video. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.